You've described your childhood in Augusta, Georgia as our little Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Why was it so bountiful?
It was magical in that I was growing up in the Jim Crow South, segregation everywhere, and I could have been in a situation where it would have been easy to have worn that differently. But I was very lucky to grow up in a loving community, around the corner from our church, down the road from my elementary school, with parents who were incredibly interested in education and in developing the minds and bodies of their 5 children. And so we were a part of a loving community. The person across the street from us, Miss Hubert, was as interested in my report card as my aunt or my mother or my father. And one had to show it to her. And she would also say, well, why do you have a B? I said, well, it's physics. I mean, really. But it was a wonderful way. Of course, when you're growing up, you haven't the faintest idea that everybody else in the world isn't growing up the same. So the fact that we had to beg to please be allowed to have cereal on a Saturday instead of a hot breakfast, which of course we were made to eat the rest of the time. And of course, who knew? And it's just, that kind of thing I think about now as having taken it all for granted. But the fact that my father would somehow arrange his day, my father was the manager of an insurance company, he would somehow arrange his day to drive me wherever I had to sing, and I was singing all the time, I promise you. I sang more as a child than I did as a professional. They didn't have to pay me, you see, so it was fine. But I was singing for the opening of a grocery store, for the opening of a recreation center. It's true, I promise you. I sang for the opening of a grocery store. And it wasn't a very big grocery store either. The opening of a new sort of store downtown for shoes or something. And certainly for the Parents Teachers Association. I was kind of, I think, the mascot or something for the Parents Teacher Association. But it was that kind of experience growing up as a child that made it possible for me to have an interesting and happy life growing up in a situation that could have made me feel very differently about myself and very differently about my place in the world. And I think, just a lucky break.
But you must have been aware, growing up in the Deep South in the
course.
1950s and 60s.
Absolutely.
You were surrounded by signs of segregation.
Absolutely. There were water fountains, one that would say written colored, and the next one would say white. And because at age 5 or 6, I simply didn't understand what the nonsense was about, I was to go to the white fountain and turn on the water, and I'd go to the colored fountain and turn on the water, and I would say to my mother as if she didn't know, but they're the same. And I tell the story always about the first trip that I remember of our going on a trip from Augusta, Georgia to Philadelphia to visit friends of ours there, and we went by train. And of course, in those days, people got dressed up to go onto a train trip. And we went to the train station, and it wasn't very full of people at the time. And of course, there was a white section and a colored section. And so I went over and sat in the white section and played around and sort of said to my mother, well, the seats are the same. It's just on the other side of the room. What is this? And at some point, my mother said, oh, just sit down and be quiet. And she didn't say, come back over and sit with us. She just left me there.
But could you sense her anxiety?
No, I don't think she was anxious at all.
Okay.
Absolutely not. And as a young child, I was a member of the Youth Center for NAACP, the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People. And my brother, who was just 4 or 5 years older than I, was the president of this association. So we were involved in sit-ins, and we were given money by the NAACP to go and actually sit at a lunch counter, and if you were given food, at least you could pay for it. But most of the time, we were completely ignored. And I just thought that people just didn't know how to behave well. I still do.
And you weren't nervous, or your parents sort of insulated you from?
Well, I wasn't insulated. I was just such a kind of rebellious spirit that I thought if people could just sort of think about it. And I said to my mother at one point, well, how could somebody dislike me? They don't even know me. I clean up my room on a Saturday the way you're supposed to. I'm a good person. But I was completely unaccepting of the fact of segregation. And I was that way all my life. I mean, when we were marching in the streets, and there was an occasion when we were marching, and we were all children, and we were marching against a supermarket that was in the black community, but they didn't hire anybody of our race to do anything in the store except clean the floors and maybe sort of lock up at night. And it was a huge store, and there were lots of food and lots of things they were selling there, and there were lots of cash registers. And there wasn't a single black person on the cash registers. And so one of the organizations in the city decided that we would boycott this particular supermarket. And so we were there sort of on our day to do that, sort of marching, and it was only because some of the children in the back screamed that we weren't run over by a car, because the car was aiming for us. And he missed us only because we were able to get out of the way. But people were determined that the old South would rise again, and we were determined that it would not. And even as children, we understood that what was being told us about us simply was not true. Because my girlfriend, Andre, could play the piano as well as anybody that I saw on television. So why wasn't she allowed to be on television? So it was just the kind of thing that I experienced that I simply refused to accept or refused to sort of wear.
There were 5 children in the family,
yes,
and your
5.
parents, as you were saying, had a strong emphasis on education.
Oh, yes.
And 3 of you went to a large segregated school, and the younger 2 to an integrated school.
Uh-huh.
And it's ironic, because I've read this in other places as well, because you describe going to a segregated school as actually being a kind of a blessing.
It's been an incredible blessing. And I say this without wanting people to think that we should go back to separate but equal. Plessy versus Ferguson was not a good idea then, and it certainly wouldn't be a good idea now. The separation of the races and calling this equal. But the thing was, you see, I grew up with teachers in my elementary school, in my middle school, in my high school, who wanted us to do well. We were the first generation of children born after World War II, and therefore they were there to see to it that we were going to have it were a better life than they had had. And so I was telling the other day, the vice principal of my elementary school had a piano in her office that if you arrived a half hour before school was meant to start, you could go into Mrs. Brown's office and sing with her. And we'd sing whatever she would play on the piano, and we would start school in that way. There was a chorus, there was a band, there was a dance class, all of this. Our parents at that time would not have stood for an education, a public school education, that did not include the arts. They wouldn't have stood for it. There would have been no discussion of taking away the arts because it's too expensive, or is it really necessary? They knew instinctively that it was necessary. And just as we at my wonderful school in Augusta, some of those children are coming up in 2 or 3 days, isn't that wonderful? But just as we are trying to not to build necessarily people that will become performers in the arts, we want to help to build complete people. And we know that this is just as important as science and technology and engineering and mathematics.
But it wasn't just the arts. Yeah. I certainly second that emotion. But it wasn't just the arts. It was that by being in a segregated school, they cared more for you. They paid more attention.
They paid more attention. I mean, there was no such thing as cutting class or not coming to school. Because if you cut class, then everybody knew about it, and your mother knew about it before you got home, which wasn't a good thing. And there was no truancy, because there were people that were sent out. If somebody was missing from the class, was that person sick? They had to be really sick in bed not to be at school. And so there were people that would call your home if you were not in class, even though the classes were overcrowded. Some of the classes in which I studied as an elementary school student, there were 40 kids. But we sat alphabetically in the classroom, so it was easy for the teacher to know whether or not there was someone missing and who was missing. And so this kind of attention was something I think that helped us all to try to do our best, knowing that they wanted us to do our best. I mean, if there were, for instance, there was a problem when I first started studying algebra. I didn't get it. And the professor whom I adore to this moment was called William Self. And he said, "You're not really understanding very much about algebra." I said, "I'm not interested in it really." And I was I was taking high school classes that would make it possible for me to go to medical school. So I had to have a certain number of science and mathematics courses. And so he invited me after class. He said, "Come and stay with me after class. We're going to go through this." Now, he did not have to do that. He had dozens and dozens of other students with whom he was working. But he took me after class to sort of explain the principle of algebra and all the rest of it. And of course, then I understood it. And I understood that I had to be interested in it as well. But it was that kind of encouragement and that kind of paying attention to what the students are doing that, of course, at the time, as I always say, we took it completely for granted. We just assumed this is the way school went, that your teachers were interested in what you were doing, that they wanted you to do well. And of course, now I realize that that was really very special and that we were very fortunate, really.
Jessye Norman, Stand Up Straight and Sing is the title of a memoir you wrote in 2014. And the admonition to stand up straight is something that many children hear from their parents,
yes,
but maybe not always the part about singing.
Yeah.
Why did you choose this title?
I chose that title because that was everything my mother used to say to me. Every time I was going out on stage many times a week to sing someplace, I had the tendency to slouch. And she would say, "Honey, stand up straight and sing." And so I thought that in honor of her, I would put that as the title of the book, because it was something I heard at least 2,500 times.
But there are other layers to that, the idea of standing up and standing up straight.
Yes, absolutely. Standing up straight in this world and singing for those things that are important to you. That aside from being involved in our own professions, and I say this as often as I can, that we have to understand that we're living in communities. We're living in communities where, certainly in the United States, there are too many people that are homeless. There are too many people that go to bed at night with not enough food. There are too many children that are getting maybe to middle school and dropping out of school altogether. What are you going to do in life with an 8th grade education? How are you going to become a full citizen? How are you going to pay taxes and contribute to your own society if you do not stay and educate yourself so that you can have a life that can be nourishing for you and for those around you? But I think it's important that we should understand that whatever we're doing, we're growing up in a community of people, and we have to care about them.
The church was the center of your community's spiritual, social, musical, and political
Absolutely.
life. And you grew up singing spirituals and gospel songs, and later they became part of your concert repertoire.
Oh, absolutely.
What does it mean to you to sing a spiritual, both back then and now?
Well, how shall I explain that? Singing a spiritual, I'm channeling my grandmother, who had an absolutely beautiful voice and sang all the time. I'll tell you a little story. I have a production that I call Sacred Ellington. Duke Ellington composed 3 different sacred concerts in the late 60s. And what I did was to take music from the 3 different concerts, and it uses dancer, we use a tap dancer, we have a gospel choir, we have a gospel choir, yes, and then we have a string quartet. We also have an orchestra. It's a big production. Anyway, so we were doing this at the Episcopal Cathedral in Philadelphia. And after the performance, there was applause, and they wanted us to do something else. And we'd exhausted the program. What could we do? And so I decided I would sing a spiritual on my own. And I mean, it's a big church, and I'd never done this before in my life. And I started to sing the spiritual, and I left the area of our performance, which was in front of the altar, and I started walking around the church. And my older brother was there at the time, and he said, I've never seen you do that before. And I said, I just thought about it. And he said, but that's exactly what your grandmother used to do. You know, the church service would be in play, and somebody would say, Sister, she was called Mamie, Sister Mamie, would you like to sing a song? And she would come up in front of the church, and she'd walk around the church sort of greeting her neighbors. And she would sing the whole time. I had no idea about that. I'd completely forgotten about it. But I was channeling her somehow, I really feel. Because I have never done that before or since. But I felt very comfortable in doing that in this huge church and feeling that was all right. And everybody, no one seemed sort of ill at ease because I was doing it. And certainly I felt fine about it. But it was really telling afterwards when my brother said, but that's exactly what your grandmama Mamie used to do.
And you used to hear her singing all the time, I think.
Yes, all the time. All times of day. You could tell her mood by whether or not she was singing a happy song or not.
One song that's not as spiritual, Amazing Grace, has a special place in your repertoire.
Yes.
Why is that?
I haven't gone anywhere in the world where people don't know Amazing Grace. I was singing in South Korea a few years ago, and we'd exhausted the whole thing that we'd sort of done on the program, and we'd done some encores as well, and the audience was still there. So I went on stage and I played for myself, Amazing Grace. The entire audience of 5,000 people sang Amazing Grace back to me. It is interesting for us to know the origin of this song. It was written by a person in the British Navy whose job it was to go to Africa, pick up slaves, put them in the bowel of his ship, and drive them back to England. On one of these occasions, there came a tempest on the ocean, and he was certain that everybody was going to drown, including his cargo in the bowels of the ship. And it was at that time that he, who really had no particular faith, started to pray. And at that moment, the words for Amazing Grace came into his mind, because in the end, the tempest calmed and everybody was saved. And this is why you have the words, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Because what he was doing was certainly wretched. And after that, he became a minister, as happens. But it's important that we should know that this song grew out of a person's epiphany and discovery of something greater than themselves. And so I suppose in the end it's not a surprise that everybody knows it, that everybody knows the song.
But does its surprising origin affect how you sing it or give it special meaning to you?
Well, I've decided, and I haven't had any of you musicologists, Miss Andre, to tell me differently, but I've decided that some of the people in the bowels of that ship were from West Africa. Amazing Grace is in what we call common meter, which in Africa is 3/4 time. Can it be that this person heard people trying to sing themselves through the horror of being in the bowels of that ship? There's no real explanation from where the tune has originated. There's all kinds of emphasis and information about where it probably came from. I think it came from the bottom of the ship. And that the people there were trying to sing themselves through this horror with music from West Africa, which very often is in 3/4 time, isn't it, Miss Andre?
You've said that opera came into your life when your parents gave you a radio for your own bedroom.
Yeah.
And this is when you were around 9 or 10 years old, and you discovered the Metropolitan Opera Saturday
By
afternoon
accident.
broadcast.
Really?
because you had to stay in your room on Saturday afternoons and clean.
And clean
You're
it, yes.
a good kid. What did you make of the opera when you were so young?
Well, I tell the story all the time because I really came across the opera by accident. I was trying to find something on the radio to accompany the chore of cleaning my room, which was not a chore at all. I was just being stupid. And I came across the opera, and I didn't know exactly what it was, except it was sort of important grown-up music. And I was very taken with the fact that the announcer could explain to you what was going on, what everything on the stage looked like, what the singers looked like, and in which language they were singing. And since Milton Cross, the announcer, told us everything that was happening, I didn't find it difficult at all to listen to an entire opera in Italian. It never occurred to me that I needed to know Italian, or that I needed to know anything about opera in order to appreciate what was going on. Roberta Peters was a fantastic singer. I didn't care whether or not I understood every word of Cara Nome. I do now, but I didn't at the time. And it didn't matter, because I felt quite comfortable sort of in my room, sort of, taking as long as it took to clean my room as the opera lasted. It was just true. The Wagner operas are the best.
Very thorough cleaning, except for Das Rheingold. That must have been a whiz.
Too slow. That's too short. There's not enough time.
But operas are full of stories that we think of as adult themes of murder, lust, madness, fidelity, yes. War. I mean, the music isn't always melodic. There's sometimes long recitatives. Yes. What did your 9 or 10-year-old sensibility make of that?
Well, since I watched Gunsmoke, no, truly, seriously, I didn't think there was anything different about, what's happening in Carmenes, what's happening to, what's her name? Who was Gunsmoke? Sort of Matt Dillon. Who was the woman who played what's her name?
Kitty.
Kitty, exactly. Kitty had a hard time. It wasn't quite as bad as Carmen, but, she wasn't the star of some Gunsmoke. No, but because I had, I grew up between 2 boys, so I had a lot of experience with sort of looking at some cowboys and that sort of thing with them. And so the idea of a murder taking place on a stage when I knew it wasn't true, and that nobody was really hurt because I had to sing the next Saturday as well. That it didn't stir me at all. And anyway, in my 9 or 10-year-old mind, I wasn't thinking about it in any deep fashion at all, except that it was beautiful music, and I loved it.
Were there any operas that made a special impression on you?
La Chia de l'Amour made a special impression on me because, and I've been looking for this it's a cartoon that I'd seen on television where they had done the sextet. And I loved it so much, I thought, I think that's opera music, I said at the time. And then not too long after that, Lucia de l'Amour was on the radio. And I said, I knew I'd heard that song before. And I stayed with it. It's been in my mind forever. And every time I could see a performance of that, I've done it. So I've seen it with a lot of singers, not the least of whom was Joan Sutherland, my goodness. She could outsing a piccolo on any day. Well, she could.
Jessye Norman, you took piano lessons as a child, and I think you once said that you and all your sibs were sent off for piano lessons
yes.
as soon as you could walk.
Yes.
You clearly loved to sing, and you were good at it. How come no singing lessons?
Well, I think that's just the luck of the draw. I think when I first started taking piano lessons, I didn't enjoy it very much. I didn't really sort of like my teacher very much. But then I was able to change my teacher, and then it became enjoyable to practice and to go to my piano lessons. And I think that my parents didn't want me to not enjoy singing. So even though it would have been a very bad thing for me to have had voice lessons so early in my life. Because, and listen to this, sort of youngsters, particularly for women, you should not study voice, you should not study singing until after puberty. The muscles that you use at the core of your body are not developed enough for supporting your singing. So take dance, gymnastics, anything that you can take to build strength in your body, and then long about age 15, 16, you can start very gently with singing lessons. But to do that beforehand, it is not very wise. I have not come across anyone in sort of nearly 50 years of performing where a person started voice lessons at 10 and is still singing at 25.
Even though you
the
were
muscles are simply not ready for it.
Even though you were singing at a very young age.
Oh yes, but
Nothing,
I was
that's
singing
fine.
quite naturally, absolutely.
That's fine.
But I wasn't doing anything that any other child wouldn't do. I could just do it louder, that's all. No, truly. No, I had sort of talking about sort of singing. When I was in middle school, we were very lucky. We had a brand new school. Here we are in the segregated South with a brand new school with a fantastic chemistry department and a biology lab and all the rest of it. And we had not only the choir, but we had the madrigal singers. And so I was in the choir, but I wasn't in the madrigal singers. And I thought, well, why don't I try out for the madrigal singers? So in my wisdom, I went along to try it for the madrigal singers. And Ms. Hobson said, you can't sing in the madrigal singers. And I said, well, why not? She said, I can only hear you when the other. And so I said, well, they need to sing louder. What's the problem? No one had talked to me about blending and maybe sort of singing quietly with other people. And so when I went home and said to my parents that I wasn't sort of invited to sing in the madrigal singers, I said, they really ought to sing louder. I wasn't at all upset. I just thought they didn't know what they were doing. It helps to be really naive and a little bit arrogant.
Your piano teacher recognized your vocal talent.
Yes.
And she suggested that you enter, excuse me. She suggested that you enter the Marian Anderson vocal competition in Philadelphia when you were 15. You were almost 16.
Yes.
You didn't win, but the experience opened the door to your musical education at Howard University.
It certainly did.
What happened?
Well, after the contest was over, I didn't know that at that time the age group for the competition was 16 to 30. So needless to say, there were a lot of people that had a lot more experience than this kid who was almost 16. But the experience was a good one. The people were very kind and said, after you've had a few voice lessons, come back and sing for us. But we were in Philadelphia and traveling on the train, and both my teacher, Rosa Sanders, and I had relatives in Washington. And it was the weekend, so there was no point in sort of rushing back to Augusta. We didn't have to do school or something. And so we stopped in Washington, and it happened that at Howard University, one of the deans had been the president of Payne College in Augusta, where my coach and my teacher had gone to college. So she knew this, so she called him just out of the blue to say, here we were in town, and could we come up to the school? So we did. We went up to Howard and sort of met the people in the School of Music and met the dean, who was now the associate dean in the School of Music at Howard. And so he said, there's a pedagogy class for master's students going on who's been taught by Carolyn Grant, who's the head of the voice department. So why don't we go up and see if you can sing for her? And I thought, well, why not, At the time, I didn't know that I need to warm up and get ready for singing. I just sang, whenever it was possible. And so we went up to her classroom, and we were standing outside the door, sort of waiting for the class to be finished. And there was a piano in the room where she was teaching, and the master students came out and wanted to know who was this kid sort of standing at the door, and heaven knows how I was dressed. And so at some point, Carolyn Grant beckoned us into the room, and she said, now, how old are you, and what are you going to do? And so I said, I'm nearly 16. And so she invited me to sing what I'd sung in Washington. And she listened and was very kind and dismissed the class, those who had remained, to listen to me. And she walked out of the classroom and she said, she asked, are you doing well in high school? And of course, being me, I said, oh yes, I'm on the dean's list. And so she said, well, finish high school, and I'm going to see to it that you come to Howard University, and I'm going to teach you. So it was her doing that got me a full tuition scholarship to go to Howard University, and I studied with her for 4 years. In fact, I studied with her until she passed away in 1979.
Now, you did win, I know you didn't win the competition in Philadelphia.
No, I didn't. I didn't win anything at all.
But you did win an international vocal competition in Munich while
Yeah.
you were still a graduate student at the University of Michigan.
Yeah.
And then you were invited to perform at an audition in New York for European opera directors.
Yeah.
And that's where the Deutsche Oper Berlin invited you to sing the role of Elizabeth in Wagner's Tannhäuser.
Yeah.
So here you were, you're 23, making your opera debut in a lead role, singing Wagner in Berlin.
Yes.
How did you handle the pressure?
Well, I was so excited that I didn't have any pressure. I studied conversational German for 5 weeks, 5 months, every single day at Duke University, because I didn't know whether or not people in Berlin could speak English, and I needed to be able to talk with them. After all, I was singing a German role in a German opera house, in a German opera, so I thought I needed to be able to communicate. And so I had conversational German every day. So when I arrived, at least I could speak to people. And you have to understand that I was singing my very first role as a professional singer. Well, I was singing my first opera role on the stage ever as a professional. And I was singing Elizabeth in Tannhäuser, which is a beautiful role. But I think a person a little bit older than I would have been daunted and afraid. This was an adventure for me. I was so excited, and having been invited there, I didn't know what was going to happen. I just knew that I had studied my music, and I certainly knew it. At the time, and I tell this joke all the time, I didn't know you didn't have to know everybody else's part in the opera. So I'd been very busy sort of preparing. Who knew? And it happened, which is completely outrageous. Elizabeth in Tannhäuser comes into the opera in the second act. And it's this big opera, Dich teure Halle. It's a beautiful aria. And then there's a wonderful duet, and she's in love with Tannhäuser, who's up to no good, as usual in these operas. And after the second act, Egon Seefeldner, who was the person who invited me to the opera, and who was head of the opera house, came to me in the interval. I still had to sing the third act. And he came to me and said, "This is going very well. I'd like to offer you a contract to come to sing at the opera house for 3 years." And I thought, really? And I said to him, and I say this over and over again, "But I haven't sung the third act." And he said, "That's all right. That's the aria I heard you sing in New York. That's why you got the job." But it was my good fortune to be able to go from being a student at Michigan to being a member of the ensemble in Berlin. I mean, it's just crazy.
It's extraordinary. But I want to ask a little more about that
Yes.
preparation, because it wasn't just learning all the roles. I mean, Tannhäuser explores the dichotomy between flesh and spirit,
Yes.
between the sacred and the profane,
yes.
redemption through love. You sang the role of the strong, pure, and saintly Elizabeth.
Exactly.
How did you approach playing this character?
Well, as I had sung the prayer, which is beautiful, I don't know if you know it, but it's a beautiful prayer. As I had sung that several times and did this for Seefeldner, who invited me to the opera to do this, I was very aware of her saintliness and her purity, as opposed to the other female character in the opera, Venus, who really, she was something.
Well, she's the temptation,
She was
the
the
seductress.
temptation and the profane in the opera, who seduces Tannhäuser, and off he goes. And so I was prepared, I guess, in my mind for what I knew what was going to happen before I had learned the second act. So I had sung the prayer, Elizabeth's Gebet, several times before I learned Dich teure Halle. And so I was already very much involved in the part. because I started from the back. So I started from where she ends up rather than from where she starts.
We have where she starts. We have the aria from Tannhäuser from the beginning of Act 2. This is Elizabeth's greeting. Here's Jessye Norman with the London Philharmonic, conducted by Klaus Tenstedt.
Oh my goodness. Thank you.
Jessye Norman singing Dichter Halle from Richard Wagner's opera. I'm going to do that again.
Yeah, and that's the first thing that Elizabeth sings. I mean, anybody with any sense would have been terrified. But I just thought, oh gosh, isn't this wonderful? Oh, I'm going to sing this thing on stage with an orchestra and everybody in a costume. I'm almost 24, la la la.
And watching you listen to it, you mouth the words, you move your hands, you close your eyes. Elizabeth has such joy at Tannhäuser's return. So do you feel that? Do you inhabit that when you hear it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she's just beside herself that he's there again when he was away, as she says in that aria, that everything was dark and dreary. And now he's back. And now everything's going to be wonderful. And the hall of song is going to be filled again with music. And this is wonderful. I say hello to you. I greet you. I welcome you. Absolutely.
Jessye Norman with me on stage at the Toronto Reference Library. She's my guest on Writers and Company on CBC Radio 1, on Sirius XM Radio, and around the world on cbc.ca. I'm Eleanor Wachtel. Jessye Norman, what are the vocal demands of singing the role of Elizabeth?
The vocal demands, I think the vocal demands are the same for me, whether I'm singing for a group of 30 people or singing for a group of 3,000. Because on any occasion I want to do what is possible on that particular day. So I try not to allow the occasion of the singing to overpower the thought that I have to perform, whether I'm privileged in singing for a presidential inauguration or for the Queen's birthday or whatever. I try not to sort of think about that too much and just do what it is I'm supposed to do. I mean, I have to run back again to this whole thing of Berlin and Tannhäuser. When I was at Howard University, there was a production of Fidelio, concert version, and the choir from Howard University was asked to be the choir in Fidelio. Now, the person who was singing Florastand was a man called Hans Dreyer. And Hans Dreyer was Tannhäuser when I sang in Berlin. It was absurd. So I could have been completely overcome by the fact that it was an incredible voice, Hans Dreyer. I could have been completely overcome by the fact that I was going to sing with him, not only to sort of sing this role, but I've been blessed with so many occasions that if I were to think about them beforehand and concentrate on the fact that this is this kind of thing, I don't think I'd be able to sing at all. So I have to put that aside and do the work, whether it's, singing for a blessed person that's passed on, or whether, it's for some marvelous thing like Nelson Mandela's 70th birthday.
Why do you think your voice is so well suited to Wagner's music?
I think it's well suited to Wagner's music. I have, from Carolyn Grant, I had a very classical vocal training, which means that she took my 3 different voices and tried to help me to understand to use all of the voice that I had equally.
Explain the 3.
Yes, how can I explain that? For the singers in the audience, you know what I mean, that you have a low voice, you have a voice in the middle, and then you have a top voice. And when I started with Carolyn Grant, as I'd never had a voice lesson before, I had 3 voices. I mean, I could sing very high, I could sing in the middle, I could sing very low. And what I had to learn was to integrate these 3 things into one voice. And because she never let me, Carolyn Grant had been teaching voice for 45 years before I got to her. And on the first day she said, now, don't try any tricks because I know them all. And we're going to learn how to sing properly. And I think because of that kind of training, that I've been able to sing these roles and not end up not being able to sing. I haven't sort of overtaxed my voice because I've been every day, whenever it was, whether for 30 or 3,000, singing with support. I talk about this all the time, don't I, singing students?
But you have an unusual range.
I have an unusual range, and that's just a gift. We have to understand that we are already born with the timbre of our voices. What we can do with training is to change the color, and if we're very clever, we learn how to support our voices. And it's important for us to understand the physiology of singing, what is going on in your body when you're actually taking a breath and making a sound. And I do feel that if we're more comfortable with understanding the anatomy of our bodies, that we're more comfortable singing. And I say this certainly to vocal students and those of you that are professional, that we know on those days when you're just not feeling like it, when for some reason you didn't sleep well or you ate something that disturbed your stomach, and you're worried about how that's going to sound, if you understand how your voice is produced, then you know that you're going to get something that you can use, and it might not be what you would prefer, and it might not be your brightest hour, but you'll still be able to do it. And I think it's important to understand that, and to know that it's our responsibility to understand that, and that maybe we shouldn't wait for somebody else to tell us. Maybe we have to go to an anatomy class and understand, where in the world is that thing called the xiphoid process? Where is the diaphragm? How does that sort of inflate the lungs? Where is the trachea? Where are the vocal cords in your throat? And I think that if we have this idea, that it becomes a bit clearer as to exactly what singing is all about.
Now, you were going to be a doctor, right?
I thought I was going to be a doctor, yeah.
No, I mean, thinking of the anatomy lessons.
Yeah, maybe that's one of the reasons I'm sort of more interested in it than some people, I guess. I don't know.
You were the first African American to be cast in the role of Elizabeth, as opposed to the sensual temptress Venus.
Yeah.
And perhaps still the only one to play Elizabeth? Or
well, I'm not happy to say that.
Similarly, you were the first Elsa in Lohengrin. You were the first Sieglinde in Die Valkyrie, Isolde in Tristan and Isolde. Why do you think that is?
Well, I can't say why that is, except that I had the experience of starting my professional life in the opera house in Berlin, where I heard a lot of music, of course in German, but in the opera house when I started there, imagine there were 80 operas in the repertoire. So in the course of a year, 80 different operas were performed. So I had a great deal of experience just my first year in listening to opera, and I went every night because I was soaking it all up and learning so much. But why there are not more African Americans singing Wagner, I don't know. It might have something to do with the fact that Wagner probably isn't that happy that I'm singing Wagner. He wasn't exactly an open spirit. And so maybe that...
But he should be grateful, I think.
Well, I don't know about that part, but I do know that he had some issues, I think we say. And they were rather large ones, and it could be that perhaps influenced his people not to come to his music. I don't know, I can't say. That's an interesting question. I'll have to investigate that. But
do you think there are roles that you weren't offered? I mean, in a way you don't know what you didn't get, but do you think you encountered discrimination as a performer?
It would be disingenuous for me to pretend that was not the case. I don't happen to know which operas I was going to be asked to do until somebody and let me explain again. Do you know that I was invited, let me think what happened, let me get this together, because I haven't remembered this story in a very long time. But there was a person who had not seen me perform on stage. This is a journalist in Germany, with whom I did an interview on the phone. And she called me back some days later to say, "Oh my goodness, I didn't know you were African American." I said, "And? Na und?" But I'm sure that there were occasions like this woman where people simply had no idea in listening to the recordings that they'd never seen me perform. And I would not doubt that there were occasions when I might have been, as it were, up for a part that was not offered to me because of being African American. It's just that I happen not to know which they were. But it would be silly for me to pretend that that's not the case, or that wasn't the case.
You were mentioning your vocal training at Howard University and Carolyn Grant helping you with breath and control and anatomy. But you had to develop the technique, but what about the more emotional side of singing? Was that something you had to learn?
Well, I had to learn to take a lot of it out. That was one of the things that Professor Grant said all the time, that there is no point in your being in tears on stage. You have to bring that emotion to the audience. And you have to work out how to do that. You want them in the middle of Kindertotenlieder of Mahler to think, I can't hear another part of this. This is too awful. We're talking about dying children. But you have to sing the song. You have to explain the emotion. You have to have the audience to feel the emotion by the color in your voice. In diesem Wetter, in diesem Graus, I shouldn't have sent the children out. Otherwise, they would still be alive now. It's my fault that they're dead. But you have to bring the audience to that feeling. Because your being in tears on stage just really stops the show. It doesn't, that's not why you're there. You're meant to impart emotion, whether it's laughter or gaiety or sadness. As an actor, as an opera singer, that is what we're supposed to be doing.
I had the good fortune to sit in on the masterclass that you gave yesterday, and you said, we just have to think the story, and our body and voice will do the rest.
Yes, I really do feel that. I really do feel that if you're thinking of a sunny day where the sun is on your face and you really, it's the most wonderful day in the world, that shows on your face, it shows in your voice. Oh, komme holde Sommernacht. How can you sing that with your face sort of when you're saying, oh, please come this beautiful summer evening? How can you say that with a dour look on your face? Or if you're singing another song of Mahler, Ich bin der Welt abhanden gekommen. I am finished with the world. There's no reason to be here anymore. You can't sing that with a smile on your face, not if you know what you're doing. It happened to be that I was invited to do a masterclass, and this wasn't something that I wanted to do at all because I don't speak Russian, so therefore I was uncomfortable being invited to give a masterclass in Russia. But anyway, there was meant to be somebody translating for me, but to have somebody translating, you're trying to help somebody with something that is coming out of their body, it's just too difficult. I would never agree to do it again. But in the course of the afternoon, there was a young woman who was singing In trine morbide, in quelle trine morbide. And she was smiling. I said, no. Let us get the text in Russian so that you know what it is you're singing. Because if you're singing about this incredible death, you can't smile. But she didn't know the words. She didn't understand the text. So she said, no. Let us look at this differently. And once she did, and once she understood, it's really true. And we didn't have time to work through the whole aria. But when she understood what she was saying, her whole demeanor changed. And I say all the time, let's not sing in a language that we haven't studied. Singers, please let's not do that. Because I think that we would give a misinterpretation and a misunderstanding of what we're doing.
But you were very assiduous. I mean, someone can sing an aria and then read a translation so they know what the words are, but you're so assiduous that you wouldn't sing in a language that you didn't know. I mean,
yes.
You studied first German and then, French, Italian.
Yeah. And I had to learn to read Hungarian because I was going to record Bluebeard and singing with other Hungarian singers.
An opera by Bartók.
Yeah, Bartók, exactly. And so at the time, I had a Hungarian teacher in Europe because I was working a great deal there, but I also had a Hungarian teacher in New York. But we were working from the same book, so they knew where I was. The two teachers knew where I was in my preparation. And I was very glad to do that. I can read Hungarian, I can't speak it. It's one of the few languages that I've studied where it isn't organized at all the way a Romance language is organized. Anybody who speaks Hungarian or Russian knows this is the truth. I mean, you don't know where the subject is, where's the verb, where is the adverb. It's all very, very different. And it was a challenge, but I just felt so much better about it, knowing that I could say the word that comes up a lot, Bluebeard, keksokalu, to be able to say that properly and not sort of do an approximation just because I'm American.
What does it mean?
It means Bluebeard.
Oh.
We say that rather a lot.
See how It goes to show how strange Hungarian is, though. Jessye Norman, with all your early success in Europe and then back in the States, you didn't make your debut at the Metropolitan Opera until like 1982, 83. 83. And you sang the role of Cassandra in Hector Berlioz's Les Troyens. And you say this happened after about a decade of having been considered for various roles there. What happened? Did you mind not performing there before?
I didn't mind at all. I was, thank goodness, very, very, very busy. And the things for which the roles that I was offered, I said, I don't want to make my debut at the Opera House singing that.
Like what?
Well, I prefer not because other people sang them. And I wouldn't like to.
Even now they would know 35 years later that...
No, I was just, it's a bit awkward. But... So why not sing opening night of the 100th anniversary season? Why not? But the things that had been offered to me before I didn't feel were suitable at all. And I was very happy to do Cassandra, which I had done in Paris and in Covent Garden. And it turned out that I got to sing the two roles, Cassandra and Dido, on the same evening. And that's quite a thing to do.
Yeah. Now, apart from dying twice.
Yes, I've died twice. Yes.
How difficult was that? I mean,
it was very difficult because they're two completely different characters. Here you have this almost sorceress person, Cassandra, singing. Then you have this classically wonderful Dido in the next part of the opera. So it was a challenge, but it was one that I wanted very much to do the two parts. And James Levine said, no, sing Cassandra first and then sort of get used to being on the stage and then perhaps sing Dido and then back and forth. And it was only because my dear colleague Tatiana Trajonas was not terribly well. And so one night I had sung Cassandra. Imagine this. Is this ever happened to any of you other singers? I had sung my part of the opera, which is the first part of Les Troyens, and I had to stay in the opera house until she started, Tatiana, in the role of Dido, because I was covering Dido. But once she was on stage, then one could leave. And so I left and was at an apartment that I'd rented in New York with friends, and we were just beginning to order Chinese food for dinner. And the phone rang, and it was the opera house, and they said, you have to come back, Tatiana's not well. And I said, okay, this is really true. I said to the person on the phone, where are you in the opera? Meaning so that I could start, in my mind. He said, I'm in my office. I said, Charlie, that wasn't my question. What page are you on?
So it was a good thing that you learned all the roles.
So I learned all the roles. So I got in the taxi and went back to the opera house. Sort of made the taxi driver crazy because I had to warm up, of course, again. Can you imagine sitting in a taxi warming up? That poor man, he probably can't hear to this day. But I got to the opera house and my Dido costume was locked up someplace, so I had to put on my Cassandra costume and finish the opera in my Cassandra costume. So get ready for that kind of experience, singers. It's not always a smooth run.
You're drawn to operas that present complicated female characters, like Dido or Judith in Bartók's Bluebeard's Castle, or the unnamed woman in Schoenberg's Erwartung, the woman in La Voix Humaine, the human voice, Poulenc's opera based on the Jean Cocteau play.
Yes.
These are women who suffer for love, they're abandoned, scorned, driven mad, but they still have agency. You said, this kind of complexity I grab with both hands.
Yes.
How do you understand these women?
Well, I studied them very much. I mean, I've read the Cocteau play, I can't tell you how many times I did before doing this on stage. And of course, there's a wonderful recording that Simone Signoret did for the Radio France. And it is wonderful to listen to that because her nuance and her cadence is exactly what Poulenc did in writing the music. And so it was really informative for me to do this. When I was doing Erwartung of Schoenberg for the first time, I was working in Los Angeles, so it was very easy. I went to the University of Southern California to the collection of Schoenberg. And they allowed me to go into the room where all of these wonderful manuscripts are kept. It was very cold, because manuscripts have to be kept a certain temperature. So somebody brought me a shawl and also brought me gloves. And I was given the letters that Schoenberg wrote to the librettist, who actually was a medical person. Her last name was Pappenheim.
She was a Viennese physician, Maria Pappenheim.
Exactly. And she was writing back and forth to Schoenberg about how he should set her text. And she would write in the margins of the text what should happen now, how much time the singer should take between saying this part of the text and going on. And I promise you that Schoenberg followed her every suggestion. And they worked in a white heat. Imagine having to do this via letters, back and forth. They composed this opera in 5 weeks. It's incredible. And I'm just very glad that it isn't longer, because I don't think anybody could get through it. It is really, it's atonal, of course, and extremely difficult. And it's 35 minutes long, and thank goodness it's 35 minutes.
But it's so intense.
It is so intense.
You don't know if this woman has murdered the man
Yes.
who has left her, or has he actually left her and abandoned her? I know you like the complexity of it, but how do you...
Well, you can, this particular opera, and I wish I could explain it more. I wish I had the text in front of me. I'd read some of it to you in English. But in this particular opera, Erwartung, which is a one-person opera, there isn't anybody else on stage except this imaginary corpse. Now, either she's committed a murder, or she's seen a murder committed, or the whole thing is happening in her head. And because I am as I am, I liked every night to choose which one it was going to be. Can you imagine being that complicated? But I would decide, okay, tonight I actually committed the murder. So I'm going to sing, because I'm not interrupting anybody else on stage. I don't have to get out of anybody else's way. So it is interesting for me. Perhaps it would be just, I don't know what it would be for another singer. And there are not a great number of us that sort of do this opera anyway. But I find it so interesting to be in my dressing room deciding, okay, is this happening in my head tonight? Or have I seen it done? Because it informs how I begin the words. Hier hinein, das sieht man nicht. Hier hinein. He says, here around me, I don't see anything. What is that shadow in front of me? Is that a person? And halfway through the opera, she shouts at the corpse, for 3 days, you had no time for me. I wanted to see you, and you never came. You never had any time. Keine Zeit. So lang hast du keine Zeit für mich gehabt. And so you can either sing that in tears, or you can sing it as a madwoman. Most of the time I sang it as a madwoman.
You say with a big smile on your face. And I'm just thinking, a lot of these parts, well, La Voix Humaine and Dido, I mean, you have to commit suicide too.
Yes, yes.
But you don't see that as being a victim.
Well, I do see it as being a victim. In fact, it's very interesting. When I did, and it was a concert version that I did with the Philharmonic and Zubin Mehta in New York, there were a couple of women who came to me. They were studying American sort of women's literature or something. And they came to me to say, how can you sing such a victim? I said, it's a play. It's an opera. I am not the woman in the Poulenc's opera. I'm singing about her. And the production that we did in Paris, which we also did in Tokyo, was that instead of my having to sort of put a dagger to my chest or something, the whole stage becomes red at the point that she dies. It's an amazing sight. I hope that we have filmed it, and we're still waiting for the rights from NHK, the Japan radio station, television station, to have it, because I would like my American friends to see that, because I didn't do that production here. And it really is really quite something. Sort of, because there's a lot of white on the stage, and the way the lights were done from the back and as well as from the front, at the time that it's all too much, and she knows that this person on the end of the phone, if there's actually anybody on the end of the phone, is never coming. He's left, and that's it. And so the only thing that she can do, like Dido and Alceste and all these other sort of fantastic women in opera, is to die. So instead of falling down or something like that, the director had me simply to sit on the sofa, and the whole stage becomes red, and it becomes dark, and the curtain comes down. It's quite something.
You've always been open to working with living composers, new productions, and innovative theater directors. I'm thinking in terms of a Japanese production, you had some interesting and challenging experiences with, for instance, Julie Taymor.
Yeah.
And this is, she's famous, but she hadn't quite yet staged The Lion King, but she directed you as Jocasta in a production of Stravinsky's Oedipus Rex. But you say she wanted you to wear puppet hands.
Yes. And that was the first time I would sing with my hands covered. I thought I wouldn't be able to sing at all with my hands covered. But once she showed me how effective this could be, then I was comfortable with it. But she talked me into doing a lot of things. You know, sort of
like
sort of coming down the stairs backwards, or there's a moment in the opera when Jocasta, another person who dies, there was a disc on which I was meant to fall, and the disc would rise 4 stories into the air, into the heavens of the opera house, and I wasn't keen to do that. And so I had, when I was shown how this was meant to work, I asked 4 of the stage hands to get onto the disc and let me see if it actually worked, which they were very kind, because they knew that it was completely safe. And so I would do this, and as I said to I think it was the TIFF talk I had, I just closed my eyes, because this was not something that I was comfortable in doing at all. But it was dramatic, and it really, really did work. And if you see the film, you'll see that it did work very well. But I wasn't anxious to do that.
Did you get a seatbelt or something?
Well, yes. Oh, yes, I was tied down. It was no, truly, it was completely safe. I couldn't roll off or anything like that.
And you performed in a Robert Wilson production in Paris in 1982 called Great Day in the Morning.
Yeah.
And the piece it's about spirituals and how they were created through the lives of slaves.
Yes.
And Wilson staged Amazing Grace with a powerful visual effect. Can you describe what you had to do while you were singing?
At the end of this production, which was to show to an audience that spirituals were not composed, that they were created in the course of living. And so that is what we did. We showed people doing housework or sort of working in the field and creating a spiritual and being very clever in using a spiritual to, for instance, to pass a communication that it wouldn't be safe to meet under the oak tree and to have a prayer meeting that night. So the song, I Couldn't Hear Nobody Pray, is not what you think. That was telling people in another plantation not to come. The overseers are going to be there tonight, so stay where you are. And you think that there had to be incredibly intelligent people writing these and creating these songs. At the end, Bob Wilson wanted me to sing Amazing Grace. And we were doing this at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. It has a very wide, not very deep, but a very long, wide stage. And I had to learn to do this. Imagine having to take 6 minutes, 6 full minutes, to walk from the wings to the center of the stage. There was a podium that was plexiglass, I guess it must have been, full of light, on which there was a picture that looked sort of not very much unlike this one, full of water. And by the time I sort of walked very slowly, and you have to learn to walk that slowly and not sort of shake. And so I had to learn also to hold the scapula in my shoulder really very tightly so that one could pour a picture full of water without sort of shaking. And I had to do this while singing. And so I had to time it so that Amazing Grace would be finished by the time the last drop of water came out of the picture. We rehearsed that a few times. But it was a wonderful, wonderful discipline, and it was an incredible thing to see. I mean, the audience was sometimes agitated because they wanted a bit more kind of oomph, I think, in the performance. And at the end, it was amazing because there was certainly, after a performance, imagine this, a full minute or more of complete silence. Nobody did anything. And by this time, there was, because being Robert Wilson, of course, the lighting was incredible. By this time, there was only light on my hand, on the picture. Everything else was completely in darkness. And it was certainly a minute or so before the light went from my hand. It was only after that that there was any kind of reaction from the audience. But it was quite, working with people who don't take any notice of the fact that you're an opera singer and that perhaps you haven't done this before. They just ask you to do what they like. And either it's suitable or not, but I've been very lucky. And working
you've
with
been very
who,
game, I think.
Yes, and I'm willing
well.
to try. It might not always be, something suitable, but I'm willing to try it if it's not completely outrageous.
Jessye Norman, much as you're identified with opera, the concert hall has also been a significant part of your performing career.
Oh, yes.
And you're known for your interpretation of German Lieder, and particularly Richard Strauss's Four Last Songs. Why does Strauss's music have a special place in your repertoire?
The music, that's easy. The music of Strauss has a special place for me because he truly knew how to write for the female voice.
Because he was married to one?
He was married to one, absolutely. So there are so many songs that you know that he wrote with a voice in mind, and a female voice in mind. And so it's a pleasure to sing these wonderful long phrases of his, because he's thought about it. It isn't just something that came into his head and he wrote it down and maybe it's for a tenor, maybe it's for a baritone. No, he was writing for a soprano. And it's a joy to sing that music. It truly is.
And Strauss's Four Last Songs, he composed it during the last year or two.
The last few years of his life, as it turned out, yes.
And he used 4 different poems, one by Joseph von Eichendorff, and 3 by Hermann Hesse.
Yeah.
Which of these poems speaks most directly to you?
Gosh, they all do. They speak very, very strongly to me. The one, I wouldn't say that I like most, but the one that gives me so much joy to sing is Beim Schlafen gehen, which is the 3rd song in the group, the way it's arranged now. The thought of accepting the end of life with joy. And rather than being a dramatic and unpleasant event, you're simply floating into the next life, which is not necessarily a German thought. This is more from a culture in Asia, that you look at death in a different light, as a welcoming thing rather than something that is ending something, but that lets you understand that there is another existence that awaits you. And I think that's one of the reasons that just to hear the cello, the dark strings to begin that song is something that is almost unbearable. It's wonderful. It is just truly, it was so, I just think that's some of his best music. And of course, he didn't know that he was writing it near the end of his life, but that's the way it turned out.
But it's interesting mentioning the East because Hesse is famous for Siddhartha, among other books that were very taken up in the late 60s. Steppenwolf, and so there
absolutely.
Is that sensibility.
Absolutely, and of course there was a time, I'm sure some of you might remember, when Hermann Hesse was all the rage in the 60s for sort of those of us who were flower children. And we were taking those poems to heart, and they translated rather well, I think, into English. And the depth of feeling and the depth of understanding of nature is something I think that appealed to us in English in the 60s, sort of thinking about these wonderful poems and embracing that particular poet and writer.
You're in Toronto now because of the Glenn Gould Prize, an international award for, I'm quoting, a unique lifetime contribution that has enriched the human condition through the arts. And previous Previous winners are an elite and eclectic group: Oscar Peterson, Pierre Boulez, Leonard Cohen, Philip Glass, Yo-Yo Ma, Yehudi Menuhin, to name just part of the series of laureates. But you're the first woman.
I'm the first woman. What have you people been doing?
How does that make you feel? I mean, it's...
Well, I didn't know that I was the first woman until after I'd been told that I'd won the prize. But I think that it's timely, certainly. This year, the Me Too movement and all the rest of it, I think it fits right in. Thank you, Glenn Gould Foundation.
It's such an honor and a pleasure to have the chance to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.